So this whole thing about having a war with Russia over the Ukraine, and like just think about all the idiots who fell for that, and who were all like, "Oh yeah, we have to stand with the Ukraine," and are willing to risk the world to plunge into a nuclear war over some, like, in the grand scheme of things, inconsequential country like the Ukraine, which always has been part of Russia. It's always been deeply connected to Russia. Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine, is in the Middle Ages was the capital of Russia. Okay? These are two intimately bound countries. The Ukraine did not even exist until after the Russian Revolution, about 100 years, just over 100 years ago now. Okay? So before 100 years ago, before the Russian Revolution, there was no Ukraine as an independent country. Okay? There were Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, but they did not have their own country. That was created after the Russian Revolution, and it still wasn't really an independent country. It was a Soviet. It was a Soviet state under the USSR. Okay, so it doesn't have a history of being independent of Russia. And so why should this is something that's contrived for to infuse a false sense of nationalism in modern Ukrainians, but they really don't have an independent country. They never have had a country that is separate from Russia. So it's just silly. And it's really about the Western powers trying to harm Russia by turning one of its integral uh, regional vassal states against it. And there's no way that the United States would tolerate Russia or any other country doing this to some close country in its backyard. You know, like Canada, for example. Like, would they they would never allow a country that's so intimately bound up to their own country be taken over by a force that is allied with a separate power structure. So why should Russia tolerate it? And Russia was the regime that's in power in the Ukraine has been abusing uh, ethnic Russians in the Ukraine for many years in the name of this nationalist zeal. So this is self-defense from Russia, okay? And they are going to win. And people are I can't tell you how many delusional fuckers I have talked to since this started. Like, people actually believe the propaganda. It's shocking how much they believe. Um, so yeah. And the thing is, the United States and the Western world has no, at this point, they have no moral legitimacy on the world stage as leading powers. They've shown themselves over and over again to be just run, where corruption runs rampant, where the economies are based on nothing but falsehoods, and so they don't have the moral legitimacy. At one point in time, I would have wanted the West to be the most dominant power in the world. But that's when it had the moral legitimacy to do so. They don't stand for freedom. They don't stand for free speech. They don't stand for economic freedom. They stand for lies and propaganda and repression of their people. So I don't. So there's no moral leadership from the West, and so I'm actually heartened by by the prospect of Russia becoming the top world leader in this world, the top power in this world. I'm heartened by that because I feel that Russia has, I mean, it's not perfect, certainly not perfect, but I believe that there's a modicum of freedom there that does not exist here. And so because the baton of freedom has been passed to Russia, I believe that that gives Russia its a moral legitimacy to be a global leader that surpasses any Western power. So for that reason, I am actually heartened by this news. Let's read this article, though. In Moscow this week, the Chinese and Russian leaders revealed their joint commitment to redesign the global order, an undertaking that has not been seen in 100 years. Okay. What has just taken place in Moscow is nothing less than a new Yalta, which, incidentally, is in Crimea. But unlike the momentous meeting of US President Franklin Roosevelt, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in the USSR run Crimea in 1945, this is the first time in arguably 5 centuries a political leader from the West is setting, like, that just goes to show how far the West has fallen. The first time in 5 centuries that no political leader from the West is setting the global agenda. That's how bad our current crop of leaders are in the Western world. Is they're not even at the table at the most important meeting setting the global agenda, and that's the first time that you'd be able to say that in about 500 years. So they're more pathetic than anybody who came before them, basically, in 500 years, our current crop of leaders in the West. I mean, that's pretty bad. It's Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin that are now running the multilateral, multipolar show. Western exceptionalists may deploy their crybaby routines as much as they want. Oh, and we know they'll lay it on thick. Nothing will change the spectacular optics and the underlying substance of this developing world order, especially for the global south. What Xi and Putin are setting out to do was explained in detail before their summit in 2 op-eds penned by the presidents themselves. Like a highly synchronized Russian ballet, Putin's vision was laid out in the People's Daily in China, focusing on a future bound partnership, while Xi's was published in the Russian Gazette and the RIA Novosti website, focusing on a new chapter in cooperation and common development. Right from the start of the summit, the speeches by both Xi and Putin drove the NATO crowd into a hysterical frenzy of anger and envy. Russian Foreign Minister spokeswoman Maria Zakharova perfectly captured the mood when she remarked that the West was foaming at the mouth. Foaming at the mouth. Yes, I bet they are. The front page of the Russian Gazette on Monday was iconic. Putin touring Nazi free Mariupol, chatting with residents side by side with Xi's op ed. That was, in a nutshell, Moscow's terse response to Washington's MQ-9 Reaper stunt and the International Criminal Court Kangaroo Court shenanigans. Foam at the mouth as much as you like. NATO is in the process of being thoroughly humiliated in the Ukraine. If the sound isn't working on this, by the way, YouTube, I will re-record it. Like, you're not going to get to censor me here. During their first informal meeting, Xi and Putin talked for no less than 4.5 hours. At the end, Putin personally escorted Xi into his limo. The conversation was the real deal, mapping out the lineaments of multipolarity, which starts with a solution for Ukraine. Predictably, there were very few leaks from the Sherpas, but there was quite a significant one on their in-depth exchange on Ukraine. Putin politely stressed he respects China's position, expressed in Beijing's 12-point conflict resolution plan, which has been completely rejected by Washington. But the Russian position remains ironclad: demilitarization, Ukrainian neutrality, and enshrining the new facts on the ground. In parallel, the Russian Foreign Ministry completely ruled out a role for the US, UK, France, and Germany in future Ukraine negotiations. They are not considered neutral mediators. A multipolar patchwork quilt. The next day was all about business, everything from energy and military technical cooperation to improving the efficacy of trade and economic corridors running through Eurasia. Russia already ranks first as a natural gas supplier to China, surpassing Turkmenistan and Qatar, most of it via the 3,000-kilometer Power of Siberia pipeline that runs from Siberia to China's northeastern Heilongjiang province, launched in December 2019. Negotiations on the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline via Mongolia are advancing fast. Sino-Russian cooperation in high tech will go through the roof, 79 projects at over 165 billion, everything from liquefied natural gas to aircraft construction, machine tool construction, space research, agro-industry, and upgraded economic corridors. The Chinese president explicitly said he wants to link the New Silk Road projects to the Eurasia Economic Union. This interpolation is a natural evolution. China has already signed an economic cooperation deal with EAEU. Russian macroeconomic uber strategist Sergei Glasvey's ideas are finally bearing fruit. And last but not least, there will be a new drive towards mutual settlements in national currencies and between Asia and Africa and Latin America. For all practical purposes, Putin endorsed the role of the Chinese yuan as the new trade currency of choice, while the complex discussions on a new reserved currency backed by gold and/or commodities proceed. Right. So that's huge. That right there is the end of American hegemony and Western hegemony. So once the US dollar is officially no longer the reserve currency, it's lights out for American hegemony. It's not lights out for America. America will continue as a country, but American hegemony, meaning USA as being the top global power that its power is dwarfs anything of any other power in this world. Yeah, those days are coming to an end, and they will officially end when the US dollar is no longer the reserve currency. Well on its way. For practical purposes, Putin endorsed the role of the Chinese yuan. So I've seen charts, I've seen statistics that already show. I mean, this has been well in the works for many years, where every year that goes by, there's a smaller percentage of world trade that is conducted in U.S. dollars. Okay, and more of it is being used conducted in these other currencies. And the more that that trend goes on, as less and less world trade is done in U.S. dollars, that just means that that is weakening U.S. hegemony. So, I mean, it's already significantly diminished U.S. hegemony compared to a few years ago. I mean, compared to like a decade or two ago, it's significantly diminished. The joint economic, okay, back to the article. The joint economic business offensive ties in with concerted Russia-Chinese diplomatic offensive to remake vast swaths of West Asia and Africa. Okay, so projecting their power to the vassals. Chinese diplomacy works like the matryoshka, Russian stacking dolls, in terms of delivering subtle messages. It's far from coincidental that Xi's trip to Moscow exactly coincides with the 20th anniversary of American shock and awe and the illegal invasion, occupation, and destruction of Iraq. Yes, and I believe that history will show that terrible war in Iraq, based on contrived lies, will was absolutely one of the big nails in America's coffin. In parallel, over 40 delegations from Africa arrived in Moscow a day before Xi to take part in a Russia Africa in the Multipolar World Parliamentary Conference, a run-up to the second Russia-Africa Summit next July. The area surrounding the Duma looked just like the old non-aligned movement days when most of Africa kept very close anti-imperialist relations with the USSR. Putin chose this exact moment to write off more than $20 billion in African debt. Okay, and at the beginning, I remember reading at the beginning of the Ukraine war, a lot of African countries are on the side of Russia in that war. And I know that I think it was the African Union of Nations, I think it's what it's called, or African Union of States, made a statement against that war, specifically to do with inflation, because the cost of food is very important to African countries. They don't want to have runaway inflation putting up the price of food, which then in turn leads to mass starvation. So that would be one of the main reasons why the African Union of States was opposed to this war in Ukraine. Certainly a good reason to oppose it, right? Like we don't want mass human starvation because of inflation, because the breadbasket of the world is turned into a war zone. Okay, unfortunately, Western leaders don't care about their people as much, and our leaders were all gung ho, fully on board with it. In West Asia, Russia, China are acting totally in sync. West Asia. The Saudi-Iran rapprochement was actually jump-started by Russia in Baghdad and Oman. It was these negotiations that led to the signing of the deal in Beijing. Moscow is also coordinating the Syria-Turkey rapprochement discussions. Russian diplomacy with Iran, now under strategic partnership status, is kept on a separate track. Diplomatic sources confirm that Chinese intelligence, via its own investigations, is now fully assured of Putin's vast popularity across Russia, even within the country's political elites. That means conspiracies of the regime change variety are out of the question, right? Well, that's what the West always likes to float around. China's central years, considering he may run and win the next presidential elections. China is always about continuity. So the Xi Putin summit definitively sealed China Russia as the comprehensive strategic partners for the long haul, committed to developing serious geopolitical and geoeconomic competition with declining Western hegemons, right? Declining Western hegemons are not going to be able to compete with a China Russia partnership powerhouse. This is the new world born in Moscow this week. Putin previously defined it as a new anti colonial policy. It's now laid out as a multipolar patchwork quilt. There's no turning back on the demolition of the remnants of Pax Americana. Oh, that's a beautiful sentence. There's no turning back on the demolition of the remnants of Pax Americana. All you have now, America, is remnants of your former glory. You're not even at your former, you're nowhere near your former glory. You're remnants of it. And those few remnants that remain today are being demolished. How do you like them apples? Changes that haven't happened in 100 years. In before European hegemony, the world system, AD 1250 to 1350, Janet Abu Lughod built a carefully constructed narrative showing the prevailing multipolar order when the West lagged behind the Orient. Later, the West only pulled ahead because the Orient was temporarily in disarray. We may be witnessing a similarly historic shift in the making, trespassed by a revival of Confucianism, respect for authority, emphasis on social harmony. I don't know about that. The equilibrium inherent to the Tao and the spiritual power of Eastern Orthodoxy. This is indeed a civilizational fight. Well, perhaps the stuff about Confucianism may apply to the Eastern part of the world. But I like what it's saying here. I mean, China is also modernizing too, though. But spiritual power of Eastern Orthodoxy. I believe this was prophesied, and I do believe that Eastern Orthodox Christianity is the future for Christianity, since the Western part of Christendom has turned its back on Christianity for the most part. Okay, Moscow finally welcoming the first sunny days of spring, provided this week a larger than life illustration of weeks where decades happen compared to decades where nothing happens. The two presidents bid farewell in a poignant manner. Xi said, now there are changes that haven't happened in 100 years. When we are together, we drive these changes. Putin, I agree. Xi, take care, dear friend. Putin, have a safe trip. Here's to a new day dawning from the lands of the rising sun to the Eurasian steppes. I mean, this gives me hope for the future. This gives me hope for the future. This is actually good news. You know, there's not a lot of good news that happens. This is good news. The fact that the morally and financially and spiritually and culturally bankrupt Western world is on its last legs of power, and that there's this new power structure forming to take its place. That gives hope to people who care about the future of this world, you know. Um, and so I'm heartened by this article. And I also want to say, like, another reason why, like, I was so opposed to the whole Ukraine war thing is because, I mean, it really could have been, I mean, it still could be, leading to World War III. And my grandfather fought against the Nazis in World War II. And World War II was a really terrible war. And it was meant to be the war to end all wars, right? Like, the people who fought in that war, part of what they wanted to accomplish was that there would never be any more wars like that ever again. They didn't want there to be another world war. So, you know, all these people who are so gung ho about standing with the Ukraine and therefore risking plunging the world into a World War III scenario, but doing so with as though they're pacifists. Like, these are like hippie types who would usually be against war. Like, um, like they really are betraying, like, and then but if you're going to be say you're going to be somebody who does respect the military and does you know, has a military persuasion, well, then you should also be against this war in Ukraine, because that's like dishonoring the memory and the legacy of our soldiers who fought in World War II. And the last thing they would have wanted was to see their grandchildren have to fight in a similar kind of a war. So, let me respect the legacy of my grandfather who fought in World War II by saying, I'm going to do everything I can to avoid and oppose any future world wars, anything at all even coming close to like what happened in World War II. I'm going to oppose that so much because that's part of honoring my grandfather's legacy. He was part of that as meant to be putting an end to those kinds of wars so that future generations did not have to be suffering like that. And so I just think the people who support this like who are all like gung ho about having a war with Russia are total idiots. They're playing Russian roulette with the whole world, and they don't have a moral leg to stand on because whether they're anti-war types or whether they're military types, I can make an argument as to why both types hypocritical for both types to support such war. If you're an anti-war type, well, why would you support war? Like that goes against being anti-war. That's hypocrisy right there. But if you're also a pro-military type, you shouldn't be supporting a war that risks leading us into a World War III situation because that is dishonoring the legacy of the soldiers who fought in World War II and who lost their lives in World War II with the purpose in mind that there would never be a World War like that ever again in the future. Like they did not want future generations to have to go through that. So, I don't want them to, I don't want my grandfather's um, war efforts to have been fought in vain. I want to honor that legacy by saying, yeah, I'm going to oppose anything that could even remotely possibly bring us into another world war situation. So that is the reason why I do not stand with the Ukraine, even though I am partly Ukrainian myself. And by the way, it should be pointed out that Canada has the highest number of ethnic Ukrainians of any country in the world outside of the Ukraine itself and outside of Russia. It's bosom buddy Russia. Those two have okay, but besides Russia and the Ukraine, Canada is the country with the most number of Ukrainians. And most of the Ukrainians in Canada came here around the turn of the 20th century, so like around the year 1900, came here escaping brutal conditions in the Ukraine at that time. Well, it wasn't the Ukraine. Ukraine didn't exist then, but escaping brutal conditions in Eastern Europe at that time. What was it? They were basically serfs. They were basically indentured labor, and they were starving. And they came to Canada. They were offered that if a parcel of land in the prairie provinces of equal to 160 acres in size, this was undeveloped, rough forested land, but they had 5 years to convert it. A family would have 5 years to convert that land into a working farm, and if they did so within the 5 years, they were given title deed to that land. Okay, and that's when I mean it must have been hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions. I don't know the numbers, but it was a lot of Ukrainians came to Canada at that time and settled in the prairie provinces, and that would have been among my ancestors as well. And so they were coming here before the Ukraine existed. Okay, so why should I stand with the Ukraine and that blue and yellow flag that people wave around? All of that came about after my Ukrainian ancestors were already in Canada, because that all happened, that was created after the Russian Revolution, which would have been around, what, 1918? So there was already the Ukrainians had already settled in Canada by that point and were farming the prairies. turned Canada into the breadbasket of the world, in fact, so that then, which positioned Great Britain and the Western Allies to win World War II. They would not have probably been able to win World War II if it wasn't for the supplies that they were getting from Canada. And Canada was a breadbasket of the world, and it was converted that way within about 20 years. It didn't take long by these Ukrainians who came to Canada. And to this day, if you go to any prairie provinces in Canada, you are going to find a lot of people with Ukrainian names. Okay, so the Ukrainian mark on Canada, on Western Canada, is particularly strong. But it's a Ukrainian mark that was made before the modern state of the Ukraine even existed. Okay, And in fact, if you look at the ship manifest where my Ukrainian ancestors came to Canada, they arrived here via Montreal, and it listed them down as ethnic Russians. So even back then, it was recognized that these are basically akin to Russians. All right, that's all I have to say. I am happy and heartened, and it warms the cockles of my heart to see the morally and financially and spiritually and culturally bankrupt Western powers in such disarray, and being having their power usurped by a truly uh, better better power. All right, that's all I have to say. Long live Mother Russia.